The cold night air enveloped the deserted city park. The moon, like a giant spotlight, illuminated the paths covered with fall leaves that crunched underfoot. Snoop Dogg walked at a leisurely pace, breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the rare silence. His silhouette was easily recognizable, his hood slightly covering his face, but his gold chains glistened even in the dim moonlight. But this silence soon began to seem too dense, almost ominous to him. Something had changed. Heavy footsteps sounded behind him. Snoop didn't look behind him, but he could feel the stare, intense, assessing, like a predator stalking prey. Two policemen stood nearby in the shade of the trees, their silhouettes silhouetted by the light of a street lamp. One was tall and stout, the other shorter, his hands moving nervously, as if ready to draw his weapon. They were talking among themselves, but their eyes followed him. Snoop pretended not to notice them. His gait remained relaxed, but inside he was tense. He didn't need to turn around to realize this wasn't just a random patrol. These two were looking for a reason. He could feel their gazes like sharp needles assessing his every move, his clothes, his movements. The tall policeman said something to his partner, and they moved slowly behind him. Their footsteps grew louder, more confident, as if the very fact of their presence was already an accusation. Snoop turned down another path leading to the center avenue of the park, but they kept up. A hoarse voice cut through the silence. "Hey, you! Stay where you are!" It sounded almost like an order. Snoop froze without turning around and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. At that moment, it was as if everything around him froze. Even the wind died down. "Something wrong, officers," he said in a steady but firm voice, turning to them. Two men stepped out of the shadows, their faces coming into view. Rough features, icy stares. One of them grinned, but there was nothing friendly about his grin. "We saw you acting suspiciously," said the short policeman. "Why don't you explain what you're doing here so late?" Snoop looked at him calmly, holding their gazes. His voice sounded soft, but with a note of iron. "I'm taking a walk. Is that forbidden?" The tall policeman stepped closer, a cold light burning in his eyes. "Look, we know you're kind. A walk, you say? Maybe you got some weed in your pocket, huh?" He leaned closer, trying to provoke. Snoop didn't answer right away. He only smiled slightly, the kind of smile that you can't make out, whether it was a challenge or a warning, and the silence he held them in was heavier than any words. The tall policeman stepped even closer, his heavy boots crunching roughly on the gravel. He stood so close now that Snoop could smell coffee and tobacco mixed with something metallic, perhaps the blood of a recent encounter. Tension hung in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. "So, great rapper," the tall cop began, stretching each word ironically. "You think the rules don't apply to you? You think if you're a star, you can go wherever you want and smoke your dope?" Snoop looked at him silently, not lowering his eyes. There was something so calm in his gaze that it seemed to piss the cop off even more. "Are you deaf?" The shorter officer shouted more harshly as he came closer. He looked less confident, but that didn't stop him from adding a venomous sneer to his voice. "Let's hear it. Where's your weed, huh? Maybe you hid it under your shiny rapper outfit." They laughed. It was a cold laugh, filled with schadenfreude. Snoop was still silent. He raised his hand slowly, showing that he had nothing. His movements were deliberately slow, emphatically polite. "I got nothing, officers. I'm just taking a walk." The tall policeman wrinkled his face as if he hadn't heard. "Of course you do," he said sarcastically. "Typical. What do you call yourselves, ghetto bosses? You're probably thinking about how to hide your weed right now." The low cop chuckled, adding fuel to the fire. "Come on, Mike. These types don't even try to hide. They think we're stupid." Snoop shifted his gaze from one to the other. He could see the tension building in their gestures, their words becoming more and more harsh, as if they were trying to show each other who was better. "Officers," he said at last, softly, but with an iron note. "I don't know what you're looking for, but I do know I'm not violating anything." The tall cop snapped. His hand gripped Snoop's shoulder, yanking him roughly forward. "I know you're lying," he said through gritted teeth. "People like you are always hiding something. Always." That "people like you" sounded so vile, so repulsive, that even a passerby standing in the distance froze, not knowing what to do. "I'll tell you one more time," Snoop mumbled, enduring the cold stare. "I've got nothing. Your suspicions are just your fantasies." The low cop raised his flashlight, illuminating Snoop's face as if it were a sentence. "Fantasy?" he chuckled. "Except fantasies are your songs about guns and drugs and chicks. We know your whole life is a crime. You just haven't gotten caught yet." The tall cop roughly jerked Snoop's back toward him, his voice louder. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicion of drug possession." Passers-by began to glance around, pulling out their phones, but no one dared to intervene. Snoop stood motionless, listening tensely as their words, full of racist venom, tried to crush him. But he knew. Their own anger was already their weakness. "Officers," he said at last, without flinching, "if you want to detain me without evidence, go ahead. But I warn you, this will all come out. Every word you say, every move you make." The phrase sounded so confident that the tall cop froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He realized that the game was moving into a more serious phase. The flashlight snatched Snoop's face out of the shadows, his features illuminated in sharp flashes as if in a crosshairs. The low policeman held him so close that the light was blinding. The officer's voice was a mixture of anger and contempt, as if he were not a man, but an object to be broken. "You think you're too important, don't you?" he began, waving his flashlight. "All that money, all those clips, all that shiny bling, but you're nothing to us. You know, nobody." The tall cop grinned, crossing his arms over his chest. His figure towered over Snoop, as if to confirm his partner's words. "You're the kind of guy we see every day. You think you're tough? You're just another dirtbag gangster trying to look like a big man," he said, emphasizing the word gangster as if it were an insult. Snoop stood motionless. His face remained stony, but there was a spark in the depths of his eyes, a spark that made the policeman even more nervous. This man seemed to refuse to break under their pressure, which irritated them to the point of fury. The short cop stepped closer, the flashlight now just inches from Snoop's face. "Answer me. Where'd you hide your weed? Or do you think we're dumb enough to believe you're walking around here for nothing? At night? Alone?" The light was blinding, but Snoop did not avert his gaze, continuing to look directly at them. His calmness seemed to piss them off. The tall cop, losing patience, leaned in so close that Snoop could feel his heavy breathing. "You're not talking because you know you're busted. We could stand here all night until you start talking. And you know what?" He paused, grinning. "Nobody's coming to protect you. People like you are abandoned. They're useless." These words hurt the people around him, who began to gather around, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and indignation. However, none of the policemen paid any attention. They were too focused on their victim, reveling in their supposed power. "How many times have we seen guys like you trying to be stars?" The short cop continued, his voice growing louder. "But we know what you do for a living. Drugs, dirt, crime. You can't convince us otherwise." Snoop finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Everything you say is only in your heads, officers. I won't make excuses for what I am." The words, spoken with unperturbed confidence, hit them harder than the shouting. The tall cop backed away sharply, snorting viciously, but the short one was too caught up in his intimidation. "You think it's gonna end like this? You think you can stand here and pretend you're above the law?" His voice trailed off into a shout, the flashlight now flickering in front of Snoop's face. "We're going to call a posse right now, and you're coming with us. Your rights don't mean anything here." That last phrase hung in the air. The people around him who dared to stay froze. There was a spark of anger in the eyes of some of the spectators, but Snoop didn't even blink. His voice cut through the tension again. "You can do whatever you want, officers," he said slowly. "But know one thing. Your every move is being recorded. And that light," he nodded at the lantern, "illuminates not only me, but who you really are." The low cop froze. For a moment, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. The tall one laughed harshly, but it sounded fake. "You'll be sorry you ever opened your mouth," he said. But now there was uncertainty in his voice. Snoop did not answer. He stood just as confidently, his shadow cast on the ground, strong, unmoving. It wasn't intimidation, it was resistance. The light of the flashlight waving in front of Snoop's face was so bright it looked like he was on a stage, but it was the darkest scene imaginable. The cops continued their interrogations, but now people were starting to gather around. A couple of passers-by stopped, filming what was happening on their phones. Some of them whispered, and some just stood there with a look of alarm on their faces. The low cop, noticing the crowd, seemed pleased. He straightened up and, turning to the crowd, spoke louder. "Well, it's a sight, ain't it? That's how they always are. They act like they can do anything. That's typical, isn't it?" His partner snorted, barely concealing a chuckle. The tall cop, no longer playing the role of the silent, menacing figurehead, also joined in. "Typical. Every day the same thing. Shiny chains, expensive sneakers, and that smell. What do you think it smells like, Mike?" He theatrically pretended to sniff the air. "The scent of a free ghetto?" The crowd froze. A few people seemed to want to intervene, but they were held back by some invisible barrier, fear. Others, less brave, simply averted their eyes, trying not to be seen by the cops. But the cameras kept rolling. "Hey, don't be shy," the short cop addressed the crowd. "Take pictures, come on. It's like a free show. You want to get your picture taken with this rapper? Who knows, it might be your last chance." Snoop, standing motionless in the rain of humiliation, looked up at the cops. A fire burned in his eyes, unbroken by the fury of their words. His calmness, his silent protest, seemed to reinforce their desire to humiliate him further. The tall cop leaned closer, almost touching his face. "You think you can just keep quiet? You think that makes you strong?" He grinned, glaring at the men. "Look how humble he is. Maybe he's not as dangerous as he sings in his songs." The crowd began to buzz. People chattered, some openly condemned the police, but most remained passive spectators, afraid to draw attention. One teenager said loudly, "This is wrong. Leave him alone." The tall cop turned around instantly, his eyes narrowed. He took a step toward the teenager, but his partner stopped him. "Let it go, Jack. We're not here for these brats." Snoop, without looking away, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but everyone in the crowd could hear him. "You want a show?" he asked, not to the cops, but to the crowd. "This is it. This is what reality looks like." Those words caused silence. Even the cops froze for a moment, but then the tall cop, trying to regain control of the situation, laughed loudly. "Reality. The reality is that you're a nobody. You think your music, your fame, means something? You're just like everyone else in your neighborhood. Only difference is, we're here to stop you." The crowd began to move closer, their silence becoming an increasingly loud protest. The cameras continued to capture every word, every movement, but the cops didn't seem to notice. They were too caught up in their supposed victory. "Take pictures," the short cop shouted, pointing to the crowd. "Show everyone how we keep order." But this order was becoming chaos. People began shouting outraged words. Snoop, standing in the center of this whirlwind, raised his hand, calling for silence. His calmness contrasted with their aggression. "Justice is something you can't trample on," he said, looking straight into the tall cop's eyes. That phrase sounded like a gunshot. And now, in that tense silence, even the cops began to realize that their power was beginning to falter. The tall cop, tiredly brushing aside the crowd's shouts, suddenly stepped forward and grabbed Snoop's wrist, yanking his hands down sharply. "Enough talk," he said with a wry grin. "If you're so clean, let's check it out." Snoop remained motionless, his body tense, but his face remained cold and centered. He knew that any wrong move could be used against him. "You have no right to search me," he said calmly, but his voice sounded hard as steel. "Right?" The short cop grinned, pulling out his gloves. "Are you serious? There are no lawyers here, Mr. Rapper. We have the right to do what we need to do to keep people like you under control." His words sounded so loud and self-assured, as if he were speaking not only to Snoop, but to the crowd. People around him began to chatter. Some shouted protests, but no one intervened. The cameras continued filming, capturing every humiliating detail. The tall cop was the first to begin the search. His hands roughly fumbled through Snoop's pockets, carelessly pulling out personal items, keys, phone, wallet. Folding the wallet in his hand, he shook it mockingly in the face of the crowd. "What do we have here? A wealth lesson for the ghetto? Look, Mike, looks like the rapper bought himself a couple dollars." The low cop laughed loudly, picking up on the taunts. "Maybe it's a fee for another track about how he's saving the streets." The crowd murmured. Some shouted words of support for Snoop, but fear of authority kept them from taking more active action. Snoop remained motionless, watching their actions with icy calm. His calm seemed to infuriate them even more. The tall cop tugged at the hood of his sweatshirt, revealing a gold chain. "Of course, the gold chain," he snorted, turning to the crowd. "You know what the funny thing is? These guys spend it all on bling while their neighbors are eating off the floor." Snoop didn't say a word. His silence pressed the cops harder than any accusation. The shorter cop gave in to his own rage and spun Snoop around, pushing him face first into a nearby tree. "Hands on the tree," he bellowed angrily, groping his pockets with such vigor that it looked like he was trying to shake something out of them that wasn't there. Passers-by began shouting outraged words. "This is illegal! Leave him alone!" But the cops only grinned, their confidence in their impunity unshaken. "Shut up!" shouted the tall cop toward the crowd. "Do you want order here, or do you want people like him running through your streets?" Snoop turned his head, his gaze hard, his voice calm but saturated with contempt. "Men like me? Are they the ones who don't break under the likes of you?" Snoop's words cut through the air like a knife. The crowd fell silent, and the cops stood still for a moment. But it was only a moment. The tall cop squeezed his shoulder roughly, turning him around to face him. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "You're just a statistic. We know you're as dirty as anyone who walks with you." The low cop laughed as he continued to search Snoop's stuff, but his hands were already shaking. Too many eyes, too many cameras. There was a tension in the air that even the cops were beginning to feel, but none of them were ready to let the situation go. They saw their imaginary power beginning to crumble, and this only intensified their aggression. "We'll find something. We always do," the tall cop hissed, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Snoop looked straight into his eyes and said quietly enough for only the cops to hear, "Maybe you won't find it this time, but I'll find a way to make it memorable." Those words sounded like a judgment, and the cops felt their control over the situation begin to fade. When the cops found nothing in Snoop's pockets or belongings, the tension between them only grew. Their power began to crumble under the weight of the crowd and the cameras, but instead of backing down, they decided to act even more brutally. The last weapon left was words full of venom and hatred. "That's what I've always hated about guys like you," the tall cop began, taking a step closer to Snoop. His voice was low, like the whisper of a snake, but loud enough for the crowd to hear every word. "You always act like the whole world is against you. Always think of yourselves as victims, don't you?" The low cop chuckled, picking up on his partner's mood. "Oh yeah, that's their specialty. They spend their whole lives blaming everyone but themselves. Society, the system, the police, never look in the mirror." Snoop didn't look away, didn't flinch once. His silence and calmness irritated them, as if it were a shield through which their words could not penetrate. But the cops weren't going to stop. "And what do we have here?" The tall cop continued, nodding at the gold chain with a grin. "Are you trying to show that you made yourself?" "Yeah, I did. With the money from your dirty business, right? Or is it another gift from your gangster friends?" The short cop stepped forward, adding fuel to the fire. "Tell us how you started from scratch, how you got out of your ghetto." "Oh, wait, you're still in it. All that glitter's just a disguise, right?" The crowd began to murmur, some shouting outraged words, but the cops didn't hear them. They were focused only on their victim. "So, what's next?" the tall cop went on. "Another album about how bad life is? Or maybe a song about how much you hate us? Come on, tell us how you put up with people like us every day. We're all racist, aren't we?" Snoop finally spoke, his voice quiet, but everyone could hear him. "You said the word yourself, not me." That phrase, like a thunderclap, broke the silence. The crowd froze, the cops tensed. The short cop, eyes narrowed angrily, tried to regain control. "Ha! You think you're smart? You think you can outsmart us? You're nothing. Without your songs, without your chains, you're nothing. Just another one of those we can stop when we want to." The tall cop grinned and leaned closer. "You know what's funny? You sing about your rights, your struggle, but once you walk out of your studio, you're just like everybody else. You don't mean anything on the street, you know." Snoop looked straight into the tall cop's eyes. His face remained unruffled, but there was fury in his gaze, restrained to the last drop. "I mean something, and it's not for you to decide," he said coldly. The crowd began to shout words of encouragement. People shouted, "Leave him alone. This is racist." But the cops didn't back down. The tall cop turned to the crowd, raising his hand as if demanding silence. "You all think this is racist?" he shouted. "It's the law. We're protecting you from people like him." The crowd began to move closer, anger building. Cameras captured every moment. The low cop, sensing the situation was getting out of control, turned back to Snoop. "You can play hero all you want," he hissed. "But at the end of the day, you'll always be what we see you as." Snoop replied without blinking, "And you will always remain what everyone else sees you as." These words finally shattered their confidence. The crowd was no longer silent. Their voices grew louder, and the cops realized they were losing. But before they retreated, the tall cop threw one last word: "We'll meet again. People like you always end badly." Snoop remained standing still, motionless and strong as a rock. The crowd surrounded him, protecting him. The cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment that now belonged not only to this park, but to the entire country. The crowd thickened around them like a human shield, but the two policemen were not going to back down. Their faces blazed with anger, tension soaking the air like thick smog. Snoop stood as still as a rock, his figure towering over the fear, over the humiliation, over the racist rage directed at him. The tall cop stepped forward, his face flushed, his breathing quickening. The fire of wounded pride burned in his eyes. "You think you're smarter than us? You think you can just stand here under our eyes and defy us?" Snoop looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the cop's. "I'm just standing here, officer," he said calmly. "It's not a crime, is it?" Those words, spoken so softly, sounded as if they had been fired from a cannon. The low cop stepped sharply closer, his voice breaking into a shout. "A crime? It's a crime to be like you and think the laws are on your side." Snoop did not waver. He withstood this barrage of hatred as if he had an armor of unshakable calm. His voice, again, sounded clear and confident. "The laws are for everyone. That includes me." The crowd began to buzz. People shouted words of encouragement, and the cameras continued to capture every movement, every word. The low cop, losing patience, raised the flashlight again, pointing it directly at Snoop's face. "You think you're invincible? You think this light will protect you?" he shouted, waving the lantern. "No, the light will only show everyone what you really are." Snoop smiled slightly, a slight sneer flickering at the corners of his lips. "This light won't show what isn't there," he replied. The tall cop grabbed his belt as if he was going to pull something out, but stopped. His partner whispered something to him, but it only added to his annoyance. He turned sharply to the crowd, his voice sounding like a gunshot. "Everybody back. This is none of your business." The crowd did not retreat. The people only seemed to grow closer, their presence increasingly felt. There was a sense of foreboding in the air. This moment was more than just a confrontation. It was a symbol of the struggle for justice, and the crowd knew it. Snoop took advantage of the pause, his voice cutting through the silence. "Officers, I know my rights. You know your responsibilities. Your actions are being seen by everyone right now, not just here, but out there." He nodded toward the cameras. "You might want to think about how you want this to be remembered." The words struck at the heart of the matter. The tall cop tensed, his face contorted, as if he realized that control was slipping from his grasp. The low cop, on the other hand, was trying to regain power through threats. "You think that's going to save you?" he said, stepping closer, his face only a few centimeters from Snoop's. "These cameras, these people? They'll go away and you'll stay the way you are. Just another guy off the street who thinks he can tell us what to do." Snoop exhaled softly, his voice even softer, but everyone in the crowd could hear him. "And you will remain who you are. And everyone here can see that." Silence, a moment of absolute silence. Then someone in the crowd shouted, "We see! We know!" This cry was echoed by others. The rumble of voices grew louder, and a wave of indignation swept through the crowd. The cops realized that their position was becoming increasingly precarious. But Snoop didn't move. His calm was like the center of a storm. He stood, looking straight into the cop's eyes, not averting his gaze. It wasn't just defense. It was resistance. And this moment belonged to him. The crowd grew denser, its buzz increasing with every second. The cops were getting nervous, their faces and movements showing tension. The short cop, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, stepped sharply toward Snoop. His voice was loud but shaky. "You think you can get away with this? You think all these cameras and gawkers are going to make a difference? We have reason to suspect you." Snoop turned to him with the same calmness that had never wavered once all evening. His gaze was confident and penetrating. "Reasons?" he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Officer, you say you have reasons. What reasons? What did you find?" The tall cop stepped forward, his face red with anger. "We know your kind. Your whole history is drugs, gangs, violence. You don't have to carry anything to be a criminal." These words made the crowd murmur more loudly. People shouted, "This is racism! Where is your proof?" Snoop turned his head slightly, keeping his eyes on the tall cop. His voice was quiet, but there was a formidable power in that silence. "The word no is not proof. Your job is not to know, it's to prove. So where's the proof, officers?" The tall cop froze. His hands twitched as if he wanted to grab Snoop, but the crowd gathered around him stopped him. The cameras were pointed directly at him. The low cop tried to intervene. "Evidence? We have probable cause to believe you're involved in criminal activity. That's reason enough to look into it." Snoop tilted his head slowly, his gaze even more focused. "Grounds? Can you point to one? What did you see? What I did? Where did I break the law?" Snoop's words sounded so confident, so calm, that the crowd began to chant, "Answer me! Where's the proof?" The policemen began to glance around. Their confidence was fading by the second. The tall cop tried to take the initiative again. "We saw you acting weird. You look suspicious, and that's enough." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his face expressing a slight sneer. "Suspicious? Is that a crime now? Or does that word mean something else when you're talking about people like me?" The lowly cop began to lose his composure. He stepped closer and bellowed, "Stop playing with words. We know you have something, you're just hiding it. Admit it, and it'll all be over quicker." Snoop, smiling slightly, turned to the crowd. "Do you guys hear that? They know. No proof, no reason, just because they know." The crowd exploded with a roar of indignation. People shouted accusations at the police, the cameras capturing every moment. The police began to retreat, their faces grim, but they were still trying to maintain control. The tall cop raised his hand again, trying to shout over the crowd, "We are here for your safety. We will not allow men like him to threaten your order." Snoop turned to him, his face serious, almost menacing in its stillness. "Like me? Say it straight out. Say what you mean." The tall cop fell silent. His partner couldn't find words either. They stood, surrounded by the crowd, in the crosshairs of the cameras, their power scattered like sand. Snoop stepped forward, his voice low, but everyone could hear him. "Your words are all you have, but words without proof are only fear. Fear of what you don't understand. Fear of what you can't control." The crowd applauded. The noise increased and people shouted, "Let him go! Leave him alone!" The policemen stood, confused and angry. They realized they had lost. Their usual tactics, intimidate, humiliate, suppress, had not worked. Snoop remained standing proudly and calmly, a symbol of strength and resistance. The tall cop took one last look at the crowd and finally backed away. His partner, clenching his teeth, turned and followed him. The crowd erupted in applause, but Snoop remained motionless, watching them go. He knew it was only a small victory in a big battle, but it meant everything. The cameras were still rolling. This moment would live on. The crowd around them grew denser and denser. Whispers and quiet conversations were replaced by loud shouts, indignant questions, and words of encouragement for Snoop. Phones, like little eyes, glowed on all sides, capturing every moment. The cops realized they were losing control, and their anger was only getting worse. The tall cop took a step back, trying to calm himself. His eyes wandered over the faces of the others, which now showed not only anxiety but also anger. The low cop, on the other hand, became even more aggressive. He pointed sharply at the nearest group of people. "What do you think this is? Your party? Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice harsh but trembling with underlying insecurity. "No, it's not a party," said one of the passers-by, a young man with a cell phone in his hand. His voice was loud and firm. "This is bullying, and we can all see it." The crowd murmured approvingly. A few people began to shout. "Why are you acting like this? Where's your proof?" "This is racism. Leave him alone." The tall cop stepped toward the crowd, trying to maintain his authority. "This is none of your business. We're working. Now disperse, or you too will be arrested for obstruction of justice." But instead of being frightened, people began to move closer. The cameras now captured not only the police, but their every gesture, their every threat. There was determination in the eyes of the passers-by, a sense that this moment was more than just an incident in the park. "Justice?" shouted a woman in the front rows. "Is this what you call justice? Humiliating a man because he's not like you?" Snoop stood still, but now he addressed the crowd. His voice was steady, but it was powerful. "This ain't just about me. This is about all of us. It happens every day. They hope you'll be afraid, that you'll be silent, but now you're not, and that makes a difference." These words fueled the fire. People started chanting, "Justice for all. Leave him alone. Where is your proof?" The low cop stepped toward Snoop, his face red with rage. He pointed his finger directly at him. "You're provoking them. You think you're a hero? You're nothing but a criminal, and I'll do anything to prove it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze hard. "Officer, you just proved to yourself who the provocateur is." The tall cop pulled his partner by the shoulder, his voice quieter but tenser. "Chill out. This is getting out of hand." But the crowd was no longer stopping. One of the men with the cell phone shouted, "You're violating his rights. We can all see it." Another voice, female, added, "We will not let you just walk away from your responsibility." The lowly cop, seeing that the situation was becoming more and more dangerous to their reputation, stepped back. His voice got even louder. "You're all disturbing the police. This is your last warning." "Yes, of course." someone in the crowd replied sarcastically, as well as the fact that you stopped him for no reason. The crowd began to move even closer, surrounding the police officers. They could feel the walls shrinking. The cameras recorded their every mistake, every moment of losing their composure. People asked questions louder. Why did you stop him? Where's your warrant? What did he do? The tall cop began to realize that the situation was becoming explosive. He addressed the crowd again, trying to shout them down. Break it up. We're trying to do our job. Yes, shouted the young man from the phone, and we are trying to protect a person from your work. Snoop took a step forward, stepping between the police officers and the crowd. His voice was calm, but sounded so that everyone could hear it. Leave them alone. Let them go. Everything they did has already been recorded. History will not forget. These words cooled the crowd's rumble. The people fell silent, but their gazes stayed fixed on the policemen. The tall cop realized they would have to leave if they didn't want to become an even bigger scandal. He glanced at his partner and nodded briefly. Let's go. He gritted his teeth. The low cop wanted to object, but the crowd was looking at him and he realized resisting would only make things worse. This isn't over, he hissed, stepping back. Snoop did not answer. He remained upright, his gaze fixed, his figure unwavering. The crowd erupted in applause as the cops, humiliated and defeated, began to walk away. The cameras continued to record their retreat, recording a moment that now belonged to history. Snoop exhaled slowly, but didn't move. He knew this was only part of a bigger battle, and he was ready for the next round. The crowd thickened around the police officers like a dense cocoon of cameras, voices, and intense stares. Their every move, every word was being recorded, turning this evening into a public tribunal. The tall cop began nervously adjusting his belt, his fingers fumbling as if he were looking for some way out of the situation. The low cop, on the other hand, was trying to remain aggressive, but you could hear the tremor in his voice. "You're all wrong," shouted the short cop, looking around the crowd with his eyes. "We're doing our job. This man, he was suspicious." His words were met with a roar of disapproval. People began to shout questions louder. Suspicious? In what way? Just because he was black? The tall cop raised his hand, trying to shout over the crowd. It had nothing to do with his skin color. We stopped him because he was acting weird. "Weird?" shouted a woman in the front row. "What's weird about a walk in the park? It's just racist, and you know it." The crowd murmured approvingly, echoing her words. The low cop, losing patience, stepped toward the woman. His face flushed red, his eyes darting around. "Racism? You don't even know what you're talking about. Did you see what he was doing here? We do everything by the book." "Legally?" echoed someone in the crowd. "You don't even know what law he broke. Where is your proof?" The tall cop tried to take control of the situation again by raising his voice. "Listen up, everybody. We stopped him because he matches the description of a suspect in a recent crime. This is standard procedure." The crowd froze for a moment, but then erupted into cheers again. "Description? What? A black man? That's your description? You're just trying to get away with it." Snoop took a step forward. His movements were slow, but every detail radiated confidence. He looked straight into the tall cop's eyes and spoke quietly but firmly. "A description of the suspect? Or a description of all of us?" Those words struck like lightning. The crowd roared again, shouting words of encouragement. The tall cop was speechless for a moment, his face contorted with anger. "Don't you dare accuse us! he shouted, pointing his finger at Snoop. "We risk our lives every day to protect people like you." "Like me?" Snoop repeated, his voice remaining cold and calm. "You said it again. But you know what we all hear? You're not protecting us. You're persecuting us." The crowd exploded with applause and shouts. The cops began to glance around, their confidence dissolving under the public pressure. The low cop tried to attack again. "You all just want to blame us for something that isn't there. We're doing our job. You don't know what it's like to take risks every day." "Do you know what it's like to be afraid every day?" shouted someone from the crowd. "You use your power to intimidate." The policemen froze. Their attempts to justify themselves looked more and more ridiculous. The cameras continued to record their movements. The voices of the passers-by grew louder and their faces darker. The tall cop realized they were losing, but he couldn't just walk away. "We're going to investigate all of this," he said, nodding toward Snoop. "You're not just going to walk away." Snoop smiled, his smile icy and calm. "Sure, investigate, and we'll investigate you." These words sounded like a sentence. The crowd murmured approvingly, shouting, "We see what is happening. Your time has passed." The low cop finally snapped. His face twisted with anger. He took a step toward the crowd, but the tall cop grabbed him by the shoulder. "Enough," he whispered, his voice sounding strained. "They're all against us," hissed the short cop. "We can't do anything. Let's go." The tall cop cut him off, turning back to the crowd. "This isn't over," the short cop threw in, walking off after his partner. They slowly retreated, their figures dissolving in the light of the park. The crowd was buzzing, the cameras kept filming, capturing the moment of their retreat. This was more than a victory. It was a signal of change, a small crack in the system that no one could ignore anymore. Snoop remained standing in the center of the crowd. He felt no triumph, only a quiet determination. This battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. The cameras were still glowing, and he knew their light would be a weapon against the darkness that surrounded those like him. The silence in the park was deafening. The crowd stood still, watching the police officers walk away, their silhouettes dissolving into the darkness of the night. People could not yet believe what had just happened. This was not just a confrontation. It was a moment that openly showed the cracks in the system, a moment when injustice was met with resistance. Snoop stood in the center of this swirl of emotions, calm but tense as a taut string. His gaze slid over the faces of those around him. The cameras were still pointed at him, and he knew that now was the time to say something that would be heard far beyond this park. He raised his hand, and the crowd was instantly silent. His voice, low and confident, cut through the air like a knife. "Today, you saw more than just a random incident. You saw the truth." He paused, letting those words settle in the minds of everyone present. His gaze was heavy, but not with fatigue, with determination. "You've seen how prejudice works, how a system that is supposed to protect all of us turns against some of us. They say they're protecting us, but who are they protecting?" The crowd began to buzz. Someone shouted out, "Not us." Snoop nodded in agreement. "They're not protecting us. They're protecting themselves, their power, their lies, their belief that they can do whatever they want because they wear a badge. But a badge doesn't make a man right." He took a step forward, looking directly into one of the cells. "This badge is supposed to be a symbol of justice, but instead it has become a symbol of fear for those who look like me, for those who live where I grew up. They don't see us as people. They see us as a threat." His voice grew louder, with the sound of steel in it that could cut through stone. Every time one of us is subjected to injustice, it is not only their pain, it is our collective pain. It's another crack in the foundation of our country, and every time they walk away without being held accountable, that crack grows deeper. The crowd murmured again, but Snoop raised his hand, calling for silence. But you know what the most important thing is? They're afraid. They're afraid of what you did today. You stayed. You didn't turn your back. You spoke. You filmed. You showed that their power is an illusion. Their power only works when we are silent. He paused, looking around at the crowd. His voice was softer, but it was even stronger. Today, we showed them that silence is not our way, that we see them, that we know them, that their fears are not our fears. Someone shouted out from the crowd, "We're with you." Snoop smiled slightly, but his face remained focused. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about every victim whose name we know, and every one whose name we'll never know. It's about children who must grow up without fear of those who are supposed to protect them. The crowd erupted in applause, but Snoop continued, blocking out their noise. Today is just the beginning. Tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, it must continue. We can't afford to forget. They want us to forget. They want us to go home and go back to our lives, but we won't forget. His voice was louder again, more penetrating. I know we have the power. We can make them look at us, hear us, fear us, but not fear our anger. Fear our truth, because truth is the most powerful weapon we have. The crowd began to chant, "Truth, justice, truth." Snoop took a step back, giving them a moment to vent their anger and hope. His gaze slid over the faces again. People looked to him as a leader, as the voice they had long wanted to hear. When the noise died down a little, he spoke again. Today we took a step. Tomorrow we take another and another, until we see real change. And if they think we're going to stop, they're wrong. We will never stop. The crowd erupted in applause. People shouted his name, chanting words of encouragement. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. The policemen disappeared into the night, humiliated and defeated. But their retreat was only the beginning. This night was the spark that lit the fire, and Snoop knew that fire would burn until all who stood here tonight saw real justice. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or bias in your life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your voice is incredibly important to us. We value each and every one of you and believe that together we can make the world a better place. If you like this story, please support us by liking and subscribing to our channel. This helps us to tell even more meaningful stories that really matter. Wishing you a wonderful day filled with warmth, fairness, and support from loved ones.